Good evening, my ghoul friends and booze. I hope you've brought your spines tonight, 'cause I'm about to make them tingle.
Val, how many times do I have to tell you? Men watch this channel too.
You want to start that again? How'd you like to be replaced by a tripod, Eddie?
Who's gonna read the story then?
Fine! Good evening, horror hunks watching too. You happy?
Yes.
June. A time for nuptials. A celebration of love where everything is expected to go wrong. But the eternal optimist hopes for the best. But tonight, we're swapping something borrowed for something blood-curdling. That's right. After our tale tonight, you might just find yourself thanking your lucky stars that you're not the one saying I do. As sometimes a happily ever after turns out to be a horror ever after. So without further ado, let's begin tonight's tale of matrimonial mayhem. A saga of nuptial nightmares, our frightful feature, the Bloody Bouquet.
The air was thick with tragedy as Detective Lopez stepped onto the scene. A solemn quiet had fallen over the bustling neighborhood, its silence only punctuated by the distant sirens and the soft murmur of the gathering crowd. In the heart of it all, an old Victorian house stood as the centerpiece of the grim scene, its vibrancy overwhelmed by flashing lights. A bride-to-be, life snuffed out too soon, was laying on the manicured lawn. Her body, broken by the fall from an upstairs window. Initial theory suggested suicide, but Lopez, a seasoned veteran of such tragedies, knew better than to jump to conclusions. The usual suspects of a crime scene, forensic experts, uniformed cops, medics, were all bustling about, doing their job with a practiced efficiency as Lopez neared the lifeless form of the young woman. On his approach, something peculiar caught his eye. A single, blood-red flower, its petals strikingly vibrant against the pallor of death, laid innocently next to the victim. The sight of it struck Lopez with an uncanny sense of déjà vu. He'd seen this flower before, recently, at the scenes of similar deaths. Each of them brides-to-be, each deemed suicides at first glance. He knew in his gut that this flower was more than an eerie coincidence. It was a sinister link weaving together the fate of each bride-to-be. Detective Lopez stooped to collect the peculiar blood-red flower, the first tangible blossom in the mysterious garden he was about to explore. Leaving the crime scene behind, Detective Lopez found himself cradling the strange flower. Its petals were almost unnaturally vibrant, a haunting shade of blood red. It was a lead, the only real lead he had at this point. He decided to visit the local flower shop to inquire about it. This brought him to the front door of Blossom's Bounty. Stepping into the quiet shop, Detective Lopez approached the counter, his usual confident stride replaced by a hesitant saunter. He was a fish out of water against a serene backdrop, and armed only with a single unusual flower. The florist, a kindly old man, came out from the back room and introduced himself. "Hey there, I'm Bill. What can I do for you today?" Detective Lopez unfurled his fingers, revealing the flower he was cradling. "Well, what do you have here?" Bill peered at the bloom with a puzzled look. "I was hoping you could tell me. I found this at a crime scene." "Well, it didn't come from here, I can tell you that much," Bill excitedly stated. No, I don't think you or your flower shop are involved," Detective Lopez said. "This is just, it's a little out of my league. It's not a gun or a bullet." Bill and Detective Lopez shared a laugh. "I'm just trying to find out anything I can about this flower. I've never seen one of these. Maybe the perpetrator had them special ordered?" Bill picked up the flower. It was beautiful, majestic, almost regal looking. "I'm sorry, I've never seen anything like this. But if I needed some information on something special like this, I'd check out Green Petals." "Green Petals?" "Yes, Green Petals. It's tucked away in a quieter part of town. and they'll sell you roses and daisies same as the rest of us. But the family there actually cares for some really exotic plants. It's run by this guy named Quang, I think." Detective Lopez thanked Bill for his time and took off in the direction of Green Petals. While just on the other side of town, Green Petals felt a world away from Blossom's bounty. It was packed with exotic plants and heady with the scent of unfamiliar blooms. As Detective Lopez stepped into Green Petals, he felt like he had crossed some unseen threshold into a realm of unfamiliar yet captivating plants. There were plants everywhere, plants in pots, of all sizes, crowding the space, their leaves brushing against him as he moved, each one a silent testament to the exotic charm of this little flower shop. A young man stood behind the counter, focused on his work. He looked up as Detective Lopez approached. "Can I help you?" the man asked cordially. "I hope so. I'm Detective Lopez. I was sent here by Bill from Blossom's Bounty." Detective Lopez then opened his hand, revealing the flower once more. He said Quang might be able to identify this. "Are you Quang?" The man looked at the flower, and then at Lopez. A flicker of something passed over his face. "I'm Quang, but I can't help you. I don't recognize the flower." "Well, is there anyone else here who might? It took me a while to drive here, and it's linked to a victim." Lopez pressed, trying to petition Quang's humanity. "No, sir. We are a flower shop, not Google Flowers information." Detective Lopez's gaze drifted to an old woman sitting serenely in one corner of the shop. "How about her? She might recognize it." "She is my mother, Detective," Quang said without hesitation. "But she's blind, and she doesn't speak English." "Well, can you ask her?" Lopez urged. He could feel his lead slipping away, and it showed in the desperation of his voice. Quang scoffed, his earlier politeness replaced by thinly veiled annoyance. "I said she's blind, Detective. She won't see your flower." Just then, Quang's mother spoke up. Just as Quang said, she was speaking Vietnamese. After their exchange, Detective Lopez started again. "Well, did you ask?" Only to be cut off by Quang's abrupt dismissal. "Please leave, officer. We've got customers to attend to." His voice firm and final, Detective Lopez looked around at the empty shop, begrudgingly thanked Quang, and turned for the door. As he made his way to the door, Detective Lopez couldn't help but wonder if Quang was hiding something. As Detective Lopez stepped outside, the shop door in the process of swinging shut behind him, a voice pierced the silence, like a siren in the night. "Wait!" she called out, the single syllable hanging heavy in the air. Lopez froze, the word echoing in his mind. He pivoted on his heel and looked back at the shop, his detective instincts flaring. There was something here, something crucial he was missing. Quang's mother's voice rang out again, this time her words clear and steady in a language Lopez could understand. "Bring me the flower." Surprised but compliant, Lopez returned inside, stepping past a visibly shocked Quang, and made his way towards the older woman. He extended his hand, the mysterious blood-red flower nestled within it. Her hands, old but steady, traced the contours of the bloom. A sense of recognition began to wash over her features. "This," she began, her voice soft but full of authority, "is the prince's despair." Quang's eyes widened at his mother's revelation. "But that's not possible," he stammered out, but his mother nodded in reply, her expression firm. Lopez watched the exchange, his intrigue mounting. "Excuse me, Quang's mother. Huang." "Excuse me, Huang. What is the prince's despair?" Detective Lopez asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Huang drew a deep breath and began. "It's a flower that only blooms once every 1,000 years, and on a remote mountain peak. Its bloom marks the awakening of the vengeful prince's spirit, cursed to wander the earth, fixated on brides-to-be. Is that where you found this, detective? The story sounded like silliness, and yet an eerie chill trickled down Detective Lopez's spine. Detective Lopez could scarcely believe the words as they tumbled from Huang's lips. But as the soft, steady thrum of the city hummed outside the shop, he found himself drawn into the tale she spun. Sometimes silence can mean yes, can't it? Take a seat, Detective Lopez, and I'll tell you everything. There once was a prince, she began, her voice soft and melodious despite the eerie tale she wove. He was not a good man, spoiled and entitled. He desired a beautiful maiden from a poor village. He asked her to marry him. When she refused his proposal, you see, she was already engaged to her childhood friend. They would be poor, but have true love. Anyway, the prince's fury knew no bounds. Lopez listened, captivated. He watched as Huang traced her fingers over the petals of the prince's despair, her touch almost reverent. The prince vowed that if he could not have the maiden, no man would, she continued. She and her husband-to-be fled, and the prince hunted them both. The pair managed to escape, and the prince, in his mad pursuit, died. But his spirit was another matter entirely. As Huang spoke, Lopez could see the flower in her hand beginning to wilt, its vibrant petals fading to a dull, lifeless hue at an unnatural pace. The spirit of the prince became a curse, a haunting echo of his once vibrant life. Every 1,000 years, when the prince's despair blooms, his spirit is roused from slumber. He seeks out brides-to-be, his rage growing with each failed attempt to find his lost maiden. And the wilting flower? Huang nodded. As the flower wilts, the prince's time nears its peak. The longer his search, the more violent he becomes. He is a storm, detective, one that grows in strength the longer it is allowed to rage. You say this blossom is tied to a victim? There will be more very soon. The realization settled like a stone in Detective Lopez's gut. This was not just a murder case anymore, or even a series of murder cases. It was a race against time, against a specter of the past, a vengeful prince awakened by the blooming of a flower. The air within Green Petals felt heavier, filled with a palpable sense of anticipation. Huang, has anyone ever arrested this ghost? You cannot really believe, detective. This is a story told to children to get them to sleep. This morning a story, but now I hold the flower in my hand. We need to protect the brides-to-be. Detective Lopez nodded in agreement with Huang. She paused, her sightless eyes seeming to look right through him. Only those who believe can stay. The rest must leave. Lopez held her gaze, swallowed the lump in his throat, and spoke, his voice firmer than he felt. I believe, Huang. A soft smile played on Huang's lips. I know, Detective Lopez. That's why I'm willing to help. Suddenly her head swiveled, uncannily fixing on Quang. You must leave, my son. Quang bristled. But Mama, You must leave. Her voice rang out, leaving no room for further argument. Quang shot a strained look at Lopez. He snatched his phone from the counter and reluctantly walked out of the shop. With the room emptied, Huang rose from her chair with surprising agility, moving about the shop and gathering items. Her hand fluttered over fragrant herbs, strange-looking roots, and colorful crystals, each carefully collected and arranged on a worn wooden table. The room darkened as Huang began to chant in a language foreign to Lopez. The melody was ancient, powerful, the words twisting in the air like living creatures. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise. This was not the procedural work he was accustomed to. This was something else entirely. In the center of the table, a glow formed, and in it, pictures. "What do you see, detective?" Huang's voice suddenly pierced the eerie melody. Startled, Lopez fumbled for words. Speak! The command echoed around him, her voice carrying an otherworldly force that seemed to reverberate through his very bones. With shaky breaths, he described the scene unfolding before him. I see a green field, surrounded by concrete and metal. There's a woman in white. She's dancing under a glass castle, but a shadow figure it's lurking underneath the green. Huang nodded, her hand stilling the vibrating table. "Central Park," she murmured. "The bride. The glass castle is the conservatory. Go there. When the shadow appears, these words must be recited." She uttered a phrase in the ancient language. Lopez nodded, getting ready to leave, only to stop and look back at Huang. Aren't you coming?" Huang shook her head. "My part is done, detective. It's your turn now." "Okay. Tell me the words again." Detective Lopez wrote them down phonetically so he would be able to recite them without a problem. With the chilling recitation still echoing in his ears, Detective Lopez rushed off to save another bride-to-be from the clutches of the vengeful prince. Detective Lopez's steps echoed ominously as he entered Central Park. The ethereal glow of the conservatory cast long creeping shadows, its shimmering glass structure reflecting the lights. The grounds were alive with laughter and music, oblivious to the menacing shadow figure that appeared to materialize right behind an old oak tree. Its form was an ethereal silhouette, shrouded in swirling shadows that seemed to writhe and dance with a sinister energy. The figure exuded an eerie aura, its presence evoking a sense of foreboding and unease. Though lacking distinct features, its mere presence commanded attention, casting a chilling influence over the vibrant atmosphere of the grounds. A sense of dread washed over Lopez as he quietly observed the scene. The shadow moved with an unsettling grace, gliding through the surroundings as if untouched by the physical world. Each step was deliberate and purposeful, its path calculated with an air of absolute certainty. The shadow's focus, however, remained unwavering, its gaze permanently fixated on the wedding party, as if drawn by an invisible force towards its intended target. A sense of dread enveloped Detective Lopez as he watched the sinister figure draw nearer. Detective Lopez's hand fumbled for the notepad in his pocket containing the lifeline provided by Huang, the incantation. He pulled out the paper and began to recite the strange words. Suddenly, the air around him began to swell, and the Shadow Man turned his eyes to Detective Lopez. With the swing of his hand, the Shadow Man conjured up a great wind that knocked over tables, tore up decorations, and pulled the paper from Detective Lopez's hands. The guests immediately scattered in a frenzy. The groom-to-be marched towards Lopez. "Hey, what the hell are you doing? You shouldn't even be here. We paid for a permit to do this." Before the groom could reach him, the Shadow swooped in, slipping into the groom like he was putting on a coat. The groom's body shuddered and convulsed, and his face contorted into a grimace of shock before being replaced with an expression of malevolent triumph. The prince had claimed his vessel. The transformed groom charged at Lopez and knocked him to the ground. Once on the ground, it wrapped its fingers around the detective's throat. "You thought you could hide her from me," he snarled, each word a twisted echo of the prince's torment. "She's mine! You'll die for trying to keep her from me!" Choking, and his vision blurring, Detective Lopez could feel a panic take over his body. But just as the world began to darken around him, a strange lullaby reached his ears. A steady, unwavering chant that carried the mystical words of Huang's incantation. But it wasn't Huang's voice. Was he dying? No. It was Quang. Quang stood there among the wind gusts and storm clouds forming overhead and continued reciting the words given to Detective Lopez. Emboldened, Detective Lopez clawed at the possessed groom-to-be's hands, pulling himself free from the vengeful spirit's grip. Rising to his feet, he joined Quang in the chant, their voices weaving together to create an auditory shield against the supernatural tempest around them. The park trembled beneath their combined resolve, the incantation filling the air, resonating with energy that repelled the prince's influence. The groom, the prince's puppet, thrashed violently, the possession disrupted by their unified stand. A thunderstorm began building up overhead, the rolling clouds mirroring the pandemonium on the ground. Lightning arced and repeatedly split the sky, their erratic flashes illuminating the struggle playing out below. Wind howled, gusts tearing at their clothes, but no matter the chaos swirling around them, Lopez and Quang kept their focus, their incantation unwavering and undeterred. With a final bone-rattling scream, the groom crumpled to the ground, body seizing before falling eerily still. As quickly as it had begun, the storm dissipated, leaving behind an unnatural calm that was immediately broken by the sounds of approaching sirens. Lopez, winded and disheveled, locked eyes with Quang, a smile forming on his weathered face. "What the hell are you doing here?" "My mother told me to leave. She didn't say anything about hanging around to make sure you didn't try to rob us, or anything about seeing to where you go next." "Well, Quang, despite your lack of faith, you're a good man. I'm glad your lack of faith didn't stop you from knowing the right words at the right time," Lopez quipped. Quang shrugged, his face reddening slightly. "I guess you can know something, even if you don't believe it. I mean, I believe now, obviously." He eyed the fallen groom, the man gradually stirring, groaning, as he held his head in confusion. The levity of Quang's tone didn't quite mask the awe in his eyes. Lopez couldn't help but chuckle at this. "You sure believe now, don't you?" Nudging his jacket aside, Lopez retrieved the wilted, lifeless blossom of the prince's despair. Its once vibrant red petals were now a faded shadow of their former glory. "Your mother Huang. She'd want to see this," he said, offering the flower to Quang. Quang gingerly took the frail flower, nodding with a newfound appreciation for his mother's cryptic wisdom. His gaze lifted back to the detective, curiosity replacing the earlier awe. "And what about you, detective? What's next?" Lopez shrugged, a boyish grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Well, first things first. I've got a date with some mandatory paid leave. Then there's the psych eval on the horizon. There's no way I'm dodging that bullet after this." Quang raised an eyebrow in surprise, but Lopez just chuckled again. "Trust me, you haven't seen anything until you've tried to explain something like this to the captain. Filling out the paperwork on this one is going to be a nightmare. Almost as bad as getting choked out by an evil ancient prince."
Well, my dear friends, that wraps up our tale of matrimonial mayhem. It makes you think twice about catching that bouquet, doesn't it? Weddings, they say, are supposed to be the best day of your life, and yet they rarely go as planned. But as our story tonight showed, sometimes, well, let's just say you might be thankful for a small mix-up at the florist, or a slight delay in the wedding band, compared to the alternative. As always, I hope this horrifying story brought you a bit of joy and some thrills, and reminded you that no matter how alone you feel, you always have a seat right next to Papa Bones here at Super Horror Show. Remember, my Super Horror family, each and every one of you is unique, invaluable, and an essential part of our bone-chilling community. So no matter what's going on around you, keep your chin up. Good things are on the way. Bad can't last forever. Oh, before I forget, I peeked in and found out our newlyweds are gearing up for a sequel. It's a spine-chilling saga titled The Terrifying In-Laws!